Paul, it's an honor for me and for all of us to have you here today. I think we all recognize that you have been one of our country's great public servants. So thank you for giving us this opportunity to ask you your opinions on some of the important issues in Federal Reserve history during your years in the Treasury and then at the Fed. I'll ask some questions for about half of our time, and then we'll open to the group for other questions. Let me start with your experience at the Treasury Department. President Nixon suspended gold convertibility in 1971, and that led to the collapse of the Bretton Woods arrangement. So I have three questions about that. First, what was your view at the time about the desirability of that policy? And in retrospect, what was your view? Or did we not have any choice about it at all?
Exchange rates at the Smithsonian, but it was not a very reasonable outcome from my point of view, because I didn't think the change in exchange rates were big enough to instill confidence, and the United States didn't accept any responsibility itself by way of any kind of convertibility to support it, so the foundation wasn't there for a long-lasting solution in my view. But my thought always was, we do this, and then we would redesign the international monetary system. President Nixon had no interest in redesigning the international monetary system, I think it's fair to say, nor did Mr. Connolly have much interest, which led to, I think, a more unsatisfactory situation internationally where it was easy to make the impression that we were being irresponsible.
So given that you didn't get the second part of what you were hoping would happen, does it still look like the right decision in retrospect, or, as you say, there was really no choice, you couldn't negotiate something different?
Well, I think that was the right decision. The question was what happened afterwards, and the whole international exchange rate situation got out of hand. Federal Reserve policy, in my view, was not particularly credible at that point. I was in the Treasury. Every time I went on a trip abroad, I would try to get Arthur, don't ease up while I'm abroad anyway. And, you know, the inflation took hold, as you know, and it never was really brought under control for some time, and was an unsatisfactory economic situation.
Some people think that that was related to the fact that we'd gone off the gold convertibility. So how much do you think that actually contributed to the inflation that happened in the remainder of the decade?
Well, I didn't think we had any choice about the gold convertibility. I suppose, you know, we could have devalued, as we did eventually, and then tried to defend a new thing, but it didn't have enough credibility to do that. But I think we didn't accept any kind of constraint during that period, the early 1970s. And the exchange rate fell abruptly at one point, or at several points, and we never had a reaction until late in the decade. And I think there was a lack of discipline that would have been useful at the time, which was not recognized and wasn't acted upon.
So let me move forward to a later time. When you moved from the New York Fed in 1979 to become chairman of the Board of Governors, consumer prices by then were rising at more than 10% a year. And you decided to push short-term rates up even higher than the rate of inflation, as we heard earlier this morning.
The market pushed those rates up.
Absolutely. with a little facilitation from folks on Constitution Avenue. Anyway, that succeeded in bringing inflation down to 6% in 1982, 3% in 1983. So I've got several questions about all of that. First of all, why do you think inflation had gotten so high at the end of the 1970s?
Well, I guess I have to say that Federal Reserve policy contributed to it, but there was the oil crisis in the early 70s and then repeated again in the later 70s. You know, it made a profound impression on me, if nobody else, that Arthur Burns in his valedictory speech was entitled The Agony of Central Banking. And it was a long lament about how in the economic and political setting of the times, the Federal Reserve, by extension presumably any central bank, could not exercise enough restraint to keep inflation under control. It was a pretty sad story. And, you know, if you were going to follow that line, you were going to give up, I guess. And I didn't think you could give up. And if I was in that job, that was the challenge. As other chairman of the Federal Reserve know, they inherit a certain challenge.
So some people thought at the time that it was just going to be too costly in terms of lost GDP and higher unemployment to get down from where inflation was at that point down to low single digits. So I think there was a recommendation, at least among some academic economists, to stop further increases in inflation, but not to try to bring inflation down, because that would be so costly.
Well, the favorite word at the time, which was very popular within the Federal Reserve, but I think probably popular in the academic community generally, was gradualism. I don't quite remember, they said don't bring it down at all, but, you know, take it easy, it'll be a job of, I don't know, years, decades, or whatever, and you can do it without hurting the economy. I never thought that was realistic. The inflationary process itself brought so many dislocations and the stresses and strains. You were going to have a recession sooner or later. The idea that this was just going to go on indefinitely, and inflation rate got up to 15%, and it's going to be 20% the next year. And I mean, one little story. I think of all these stories. But shortly after we began this, somebody, I think Arthur Levitt, who was the head of the American Stock Exchange, brought in some businessmen. They tend to be small businessmen to talk to me or the Federal Reserve, and I had them for lunch, and I gave them my little patter about it's going to be tough, but we're going to stick with it, and the inflation rate's going to come down, so forth. And the first guy that responded said, it's all very fine, Mr. Volcker, but I just came from a labor negotiation in which I agreed to a 13% wage increase for the next 3 years for my employees, and I'm very happy with my settlement. I always wondered whether he was very happy 2 years later on. But you know, that was symbolic of the depths of, he was happy at a 13% wage increase.
Because he managed to get a real wage decrease.
Yeah, that's right. That's what he was figuring.
But did you have a sense of what the, quote, cost would be? That is, how high was unemployment going to be? Well, how long was this going to last?
I had no sense that interest rates were going to be so high. We knew that disappointment, I guess any central banker can be disappointed with this kind of thing. When in October we took the full panoply of measures and emphasized the money supply and so forth, I thought this was all done to convince people we were really serious. That you had already raised the discount rate 2 or 3 times in the space of 2 or 3 months. And the last increase in the discount rate was by a 4-3 vote, and I was a neophyte Federal Reserve Chairman. It was all right with me. I know I have 4 votes. We had to raise it again. I'd still have 4 votes and another 3, but that's not the way the market interpreted it. They said, they're at the end of their string. They can't command a unified majority anymore on the board. So, it's the end of the day for any Federal Reserve restraint. So I decided we had to change the playbook a little bit, and we threw everything we could into the October announcement. And I had this naive hope. I knew the short-term rates would go up, but I thought, we will instill confidence, and long-term rates will not go up. Long-term rates went up too. It's about as much as the short-term rates, which was a disappointment. But it showed how strong the psychology was.
But the inflation came down, I think, much faster than outsiders, in any case, expected. Remember, the tax cuts that were put in place were based on the idea that inflation would continue to increase tax revenue because of bracket creep. We hadn't ended the bracket adjustment process. And yet inflation, as I quoted a minute ago, was down to 6% in 1982 and half that the next year. So were you surprised at how fast the process worked?
I don't know that I was surprised, but I sure was relieved. I didn't know how long that could have gone on.
Can you say a little more about what it took to persuade the FOMC and the board to go along with this?
First of all, raising interest rates quite visibly and openly is not the easiest thing in the world for central bankers or anybody. It's much easier to lower interest rates than it is to raise interest rates. I think it's fair to say in almost any circumstances. And that 4-3 vote that I referred to reflected something of that reluctance. The Federal Reserve, there had been over sometime earlier, 3 or 4 years earlier, there was some pressure in the Open Market Committee to adopt a much stricter money supply approach. So it wasn't entirely unknown to the Federal Reserve. Now, that approach had always been rejected when it was raised, but there was a little bit of feeling, I knew, among some of the Open Market Committee members in particular, outside the board, the Reserve Bank president, a certain amount of sympathy. So you had some kind of, among some people, some kind of instinctive support, and I think, people were upset and tired about the way things were happening. They were looking for something different, something new, something that had some hope, and they realized that to over-dramatize this is the last chance. That's over-dramatizing it, but people were willing to get together, and they didn't have to. Well, we did have a big discount rate change at the time too, but everybody could get together on the new policy, and we knew pretty well that it would have a sharp impact on short-term rates, and it was meant to be highly restrictive, no doubt about that. But the board, the Open Market Committee, was pretty united.
If I remember correctly, history has you warning President Carter that something like this was going to happen, getting his at least implicit consent, and then when it actually happened, he was a very unhappy man and acted up.
I don't think it was quite that way.
You were there and I wasn't, so tell us.
When I was appointed, which was, a month or two earlier, I had made clear to him that I thought Federal Reserve policy was too easy at the time, and if I was going to be chairman, I was going to be advocating a stronger policy. And I remember I thought that I wasn't going to be appointed after that conversation, but I was appointed anyway. Showed the difficulty of the time. And then when it came to making the so-called October decision, I had warned the Secretary of the Treasury and the Chairman of the Economic Advisors at the time, Charlie Schultz, and Don Regan. No, it was Bill Miller was Secretary of the Treasury. We had to go to the IMF meeting in Belgrade. And I told them on the plane, this is what I was planning to do. And they were not too happy about it. But they didn't.
You told them on the plane going to Belgrade?
To Belgrade.
To Belgrade.
And by some
That's an important piece in the history of this.
It was important for another reason. By some bit of serendipity, Schmidt, who was then, I guess, Chancellor of Germany, had requested that we stop and talk to him in Hamburg. And I don't know how many people here know Helmut Schmidt, but he could be pretty acerbic, to say the least, and he wasn't exactly happy about the United States. And he sat there and lectured us for about an hour about the irresponsibility of the United States and letting this inflation get out of control, not having tight enough policies, and what was the matter with us. We, the leaders of the world, we better shape up and do something. And I sat there, rather happy about this lecture. But we went to Belgrade, and I was aiming for an announcement later that week. This is probably a weekend, I don't remember exactly, but and the president was informed about it, not by me. May have been a deficiency on my part, but I didn't tell him. I would have told him, I guess, when I got back, but he'd already been told by the time I got back. And he took the position, I'm told, that I don't like it much, but I just appointed the guy, and I'm not going to make a public fuss about it. And there were one or two people in the administration that I knew kind of came to me and said, go ahead and do it. No, that wasn't the unanimous view, but it was not there was no sharp rubber man. There was no...
He went on television, though, and he triggered some legal provisions which had some effect.
Oh, no. Not then. You are thinking this was a catastrophe, so I apologize. You remember this. This is relevant for the National Bureau of Economic Research. I resent them. This was later, when interest rates got up to, 20% or so maybe by the end of the year. And Carter announced a budget which was very poorly received, and my reaction, nothing was happening. The Federal Reserve staff kept saying, we're going to have this recession. The recession is beginning. There was no recession. Despite all this, the economy kept rising. And Carter was obviously under pressure, so he triggered a provision in law that permitted the Federal Reserve to put on credit controls. And so he said, I want to put on credit controls. I want to show I'm on the team, sort of, and we're going to go together, and I got to change the budget. I'm going to make the budget more restrictive. And I want to announce there'll be credit controls. And you can do, I guess we were going to tighten policy again. That was all part of the package. You wait to tighten policy. And we'll announce the credit controls. So we didn't like the idea because expansion of credit was not a problem at the time. And we didn't want to get in all the mess of managing credit controls. We thought it muddied the picture. But I felt, I didn't like it. How can we rebuff the President of the United States who's asking us to put on credit controls? Theoretically, we could have said no, but
he managed to ask you on television.
Well, I guess maybe he did.
So it was not a secret to the American public that he had that view.
Anyway, this was a phenomenon engraved in my mind. So we decided, all right, we'll put on the most modest controls we can think of. We will not put on any control over anything to do with housing, which is the biggest source of credit. I think we exempted automobiles. There's nothing the matter with automobiles. So the only thing that was left was, in those days, it was of some importance, single payment kind of consumer credit that was not, installment credit that was not related to housing or cars. It was not a very big area of the market. But we said, okay, you're going to have a reserve requirement. And credit cards. If credit cards exceeded past peaks, you would have a reserve requirement. And we did that knowing we're now in March. The peaks in credit card use comes in November and December, and we were way below it. So there was no possibility that this was going to become effective for some time. And this was all announced at a big White House ceremony.
All right, let me move on to my next related
I want to get
question.
away. The economy at that point fell like a rock, and people were cutting up credit cards, sending in the press to President for your automobile sales dropped within the space of a week or so. And the money supply dropped. We didn't know why the money supply was dropping. All of a sudden, the money supply is down 3% in a week or something. And what happened? Everybody was paying off their credit card debt by drawing down their demand deposits, and the money supply falls. And we went into what the National Bureau of Economic Research determined was a recession. Well, it was a recession, all right. The economy went down, but it was an artificial. As soon as we took off the credit controls in June, the economy began expanding again. And then things really got tough. But that was, you know, a really good argument about the...
So let me look a little further down the road. Even after inflation had dropped to 3%, the market kept interest rates very high. Treasury bills were 8 and 9%, so we had real rates on Treasury bills of 5 and 6%. So why were they so high?
Well, geez, I don't remember. At one point, well, first of all, when the economy began expanding, it was expanding very fast. So there was no problem with poor economic activity at that point. You had the potential banking crisis of Continental Illinois and this little bank in Oklahoma that went bust, but it sold a lot of loans to Continental Illinois and other banks, and there was the threat of a banking crisis. And when Continental got in trouble, that had an effect on bank, overnight bank lending, and that kept for a while. That was during the election period, actually. It kept interest rates higher than we anticipated and really higher than we wanted to. There was quite a debate on the board at that time whether we should react to what seemed an artificial increase in interest rates by easing our policies or whether we would tough it out. And we finally did ease a bit. This is what are we talking about, 84, I guess.
But you still have very high real rates,
yeah.
Short real rates. Was it a concern about inflation coming back?
I think it was just, I can't put myself back in that position. I think we were totally satisfied with what the economy was doing. And why would you still had some inflation. Why would we be easing up when the economy was expanding 6 or 7% a year? Okay. We're getting back to where we were. Everything was fine.
So let me now turn to more recent events after you left the Fed. First about the crisis and then about current policy. There were, of course, many causes of the financial crisis, and I don't want to review all of those, but I want to ask, what role do you think the Fed played in causing the crisis, and how could Fed policies have prevented it?
Well, I make a point that didn't quite come up this morning, but I think it's important and it's underrated. During the decade after the change of the century, and we had this very mild recession. It was hardly a recession in 2000 to 2001. I remember I was at a meeting with you, and you said it wasn't a recession. I said it wasn't a recession. But the National Bureau of Economic Research later said it was a recession. But it was hardly visible. I don't even think it shows a decline in the current figures. Anyway, we had these low interest rates. We were running a big balance of payments deficit, got bigger and bigger. More and more money came from Japan and China in particular and Asia. Interest rates were kept very low. And it seemed to me, inevitably, this was a kind of doomsday scenario, sooner or later, that you couldn't go on to the point of borrowing 5-6% of the GDP. And interest rates were very low, and parts of the economy were expanding very rapidly. And what to do about it? I mean, I made a speech about it once. I didn't say anything except we got to make sure we maintain price stability. I didn't directly criticize the Federal Reserve at the time because I wasn't sure. I mean, I would have been happy if it had been a little tighter, frankly, but I didn't think that was going to cure the situation because it was really an international monetary problem, that there was no discipline on either the United States or on China to take. And nobody even raised the question. And it all ended up very unhappily. So that kind of fed the boom in the United States, and I think the Federal Reserve and other banking regulators did not catch up with this. I don't know whether anyone ever would, but they didn't. And it got out of hand and collapsed in a way that I wasn't anticipating particularly, but it did it. I had no idea myself. I'm just sitting around how big the subprime mortgage problem was. I mean, it startled me when I mean, you remember these little personal incidents. I was at some meeting where I was asked to comment on the U.S. economy, I guess in the spring of '87, question, what about that mortgage market? And I said, I don't know much about that mortgage market, but I can't believe the financial system is so weak that this minor business in the mortgage market would upset it. And I got back, I called some friends in the Federal Reserve, how big is this subprime mortgage thing? I must commit, the answer I got from the first was, I don't know. And then they called me back later, and they told me, well, it looks like it's over $1 trillion. I had no imagination that the subprime mortgage thing was over $1 trillion. And it was a phenomenon of, what, 3 years maybe, from basically a standing start. In 3 years, it was $1 trillion. And obviously that was kind of the focal point of the crisis when it finally came. But this banking regulation stuff is very hard to deal with, but I think there had been a relative lack of interest in it, which was unfortunate.
Let's talk for a moment about the Volcker rule, which I remember you're saying at the time.
That's my favorite rule.
It's your favorite rule. Well, if I had a rule named after me, that would probably be my favorite rule as well. I was
at an international little meeting in last weekend, and somebody had a paper saying that was the most important part of financial reform. I have never said that, but she said it.
So that was my question. How important was proprietary trading, which I take it is the essence of the Volcker rule? How important was it as a cause of the crisis?
Well, I don't know where I'd rank it as a cause of the crisis. It was a contributing factor in the sense that led to a lot of, once the crisis started, the exposure on proprietary trading and money market funds and hedge funds. You know, this crisis kind of started with the hedge funds of Bear Stearns, which came under pressure earlier. That this thing began shaking psychology and so forth, and that was essentially a proprietary trading operation. I have seen figures that say the banks lost as much money in 2008 as they'd made on proprietary trading and hedge funds in the whole previous decade, all in one fell swoop. But obviously the weakest part of the banking system was bad loans. The difference is banks are there to make loans, and that's an essential part of the economy. They're not there, in my opinion, to trade for their own account, basically. And that's a distinction that I try to make, and it's obviously a complicating factor, if it wasn't the prime factor in the crisis. And the worst part of it, in a way, in my view, is a cultural, a psychological question. It's not just the risks that are involved directly for the whole institution. Take this J.P. Morgan thing. They lost $6 billion or whatever it was with one little play in the derivatives market, one big play in the derivatives market. And they can survive $6 billion. But what is the psychology that leads people to take that kind of risk? And the traders know that the rewards are huge, of a kind that have not been at all normal in commercial banking now or in history. And when you got that kind of cleavage between the culture and, let me call it the investment banking side of the house and the traditional commercial banking side of the house, obviously the people in the commercial banking side say, well, I want to make money too, and maybe I can make some big risks. And I'll get some mortgages together, I'll package them up, we'll securitize them, and stick them out, and we'll make a commission on it, and it's not a relationship matter. We're going to stick this out. We'll stick somebody else with it. It's a different culture. The guy that is most eloquent on this surprises me because he was never friendly toward the Federal Reserve. It was John Reed, head of Citibank at the time, and he was a leader in commercial banks going in the investment business. They bought Solomon, you may recall, and Solomon, that subsidiary, went bust later. Not too much later, but it was part of Citibank, so nothing happened. But he is very vocal. Mea culpa, we made a mistake. It destroyed the culture of the institution. And that's my major worry about it.
Another thing you've worried about are the size of the big banks. And if I remember correctly, you were in favor of breaking up the big banks. The administration, is that true?
Well, I don't know what time you're talking about, but, you know, when I left the Federal Reserve...
No, not when you were at the Fed, no, during this crisis.
Oh, during the crisis, no. I never took the view to break out the big banks. I wanted to limit their size, which I guess is in the law someplace, not very effectively. It's a lack of my imagination or something. I don't see how do you break them up, A, with a lot of disturbance, but even if you broke them up, you couldn't break them up into small enough pieces so that they wouldn't be systemically significant, or whatever we call it now. You break up J.P. Morgan in half, or Chase in half, or the same bank, another bank, Bank of America, you slice them in half, and so they're not $2 trillion banks, they're $1 trillion banks. They're still too big.
So that view, which I've heard attributed to you, shouldn't have been attributed to you, about breaking up, wanting to break them up.
No.
Let me ask you...
I wouldn't mind it. I mean, if somebody else does it, I won't.
One of the questions that came in, let me read. The high interest rates of the early 1980s caused severe debt problems in emerging economies.
Yes.
Were you surprised by this? And what options did you consider to deal with it?
It's an interesting question. But this is something like, I suppose, the subprime mortgage thing. The 70s were characterized by a lot of liquidity growing out of the oil crisis and the excess money that the Arabs had and all the rest. And that money was flowing through the big banks to Latin America in a way that arguably looked unsustainable. Arthur Burns, to his credit, was the Paul Revere on this thing. He go around and make speeches. This can't continue. It shouldn't be continued. We ought to do something about it. I was in New York Fed then, and we tried to do something about it, which was totally ineffectual, I must say. But it went on, and nobody was willing to say, if you did something that was really effectual, if that's a word, you would have had a crisis in Latin America if you shut off the flow, so nobody much wanted to be all that aggressive. And then finally, but through natural occurrences, interest rates had gotten very high, but I don't think it was just the high interest rates. The banks suddenly stopped lending to Mexico. So you had a crisis. And once one stopped, they all stopped. It was an interesting question of phenomena. This has been building up. The figures were known. The president of Mexico then, left-wing guy, was being told by his own finance minister and central bank governor, we ought to stop this or slow it down. And he sent some people around to talk to foreign banks and say, is this a problem? They all said no. This was in the summer of
82.
Summer of 81 it would have been. Because now we come to 82. So he said, he got rid of the finance minister. Wasn't he got rid of the borrowing, got rid of the finance minister. It's true. And the borrowing continued until the winter when a couple of banks stopped lending. And, Mexico ran out of money. So what do? You had a big crisis. Now, the high interest rates contributed to that, but it didn't make, that they hadn't been in effect all that long. And, it was a problem. There's no question the high interest rates aggravated the problem. So what were you going to do? You were going to conduct an easy money policy and go back on all the policy you'd undertaken to try to save Mexico, which wouldn't have saved Mexico anyway. So, no, we did save Mexico, but but by other means. It wasn't just Mexico. People forget, and this is a commentary on age. This was 82. How many years ago is that? 31. 2 years ago. I hear all this talk about crises. Nobody ever remembers the Latin American debt crisis. Memories only go back to somehow the banking crisis in 1990. It didn't make the leap back to 80. The big U.S. banks and some of the big foreign banks had more exposure to Latin America than they had capital. So it wasn't something you could just say, okay, knock off the loans by 50% or something, everybody would be happy. They all would have been bust. So you look for other approaches, and it took a decade until Mr. Brady came along and settled it all.
Let me move even more current. After you left the Fed, the board adopted, or Congress mandated, the dual mandate, and the board has set quantitative goals for inflation and unemployment. So if I remember, in your time, there were no such specific goals, and you would say something like the job of the Fed is to achieve price stability.
Right.
So I remember that.
So I excise the word gradually every time.
So my first question is, what's your opinion of the dual mandate?
I'm against it.
You're against the dual mandate. So you want to say a little more than that?
Well, I think it confuses the situation. In the Federal Reserve, the danger for the Federal Reserve now is that implicitly or explicitly, given the circumstances, it has acted and is asked to act in an extraordinary way. And it implicitly kind of gives the impression that the Federal Reserve has the keys to the kingdom, that they can achieve price stability and low unemployment at the same time, and no matter what the budget is, and all the structural problems in the economy, and the dislocations in the economy. Monetary policy will solve all problems. I think that's a bad message to give, because I don't think it's right. I don't think it's possible anyway. And I do think it confuses the situation to say, it says there's a trade-off between price stability and economic performance and employment. And I think in over any reasonable period of time, there's not a trade-off. And that the best contribution of the Federal Reserve can be to maintain price stability. I don't like this, frankly, the targeting, but that's a minor point. That, you know, that 2% is okay and 1.5 is no good, and you know, that's where it's. I know everybody kind of knows what stability is, and it's there's more than one measure of prices. So I think it's confusing. I think it makes their job more difficult. That doesn't mean their policy would be 1 inch different today than it in fact is. There is no immediate inflation problem or inflation threat, so they can be comfortably very easy. That's what they should be. So it doesn't imply any difference actually in current
Do you see
policy.
there's any political possibility of moving away from the dual mandate anytime in the future?
I think if the Federal Reserve stopped talking about it, nobody else would talk about it, and the Congress doesn't pay any attention. Look, somebody can do this research. That law was passed or amended, Humphrey-Hawkins Act, in '77. Just 2 years before he became chairman of the Federal Reserve. It's fresh legislation. I do not remember the word dual mandate ever passing my lips in all the time that I was chairman. Now, I could get by with it because inflation was very high. If somebody asked me the impact on the economy, I say, look, over time, the best thing we can do for the economy is getting rid of the inflation. And, sitting there saying with 15% inflation, well, then we didn't have high unemployment. But even when the unemployment rate got very high and the inflation rate was still 10% or whatever it was, say, oh, we got to, let's get the inflation rate up a little bit so we can get the unemployment down. I mean, it makes sense. But literal reading of the dual mandate, presumably that's what you would do. And so I think you're better. That's the advice I would give the current chairman of the Federal Reserve.
You have a chance to do that now. So that probably tells me something about what you think about the idea of unconventional policies.
Well,
but maybe it doesn't, so you tell us.
I think this crisis required some unconventional policies. There's no doubt about that.
Okay.
Extremely unconventional. Unconventional is the kindest word you can say about it when you go back a few years ago. And this current just talking about this current version, the so-called QE2, it's a matter of judgment. I don't get alarmed about it, and I'm not I think they can manage their way out of it. The chairman's made that quite clear. I think he's right. It does have dangers of speculative, it's got pluses and minuses. And the pluses I don't think are very large, and the minuses don't seem to be tremendous right at the moment either. But, since I can say it, if I was conducting these policies, I don't really understand why we're paying interest on excess reserves when we're worried about getting interest rates as low as possible. And the Federal Reserve pays more on their excess reserves than the banks can get from lending to each other. So why spend them?
So you would stop paying interest on excess reserves?
Am I expecting?
I say, would you stop paying interest on excess reserves?
It never dawned on me. Limitations on my own imagination. I was always in favor of paying interest on required reserves. But the idea of paying interest on excess reserves never occurred to me until the Federal Reserve began doing it. I can see in some circumstances it may have some advantages, but I think you're going to find it has some disadvantages too. Someday you have to make that rate pretty high if you're going to do it, I guess, when you want to tighten policy, and we'll see how that goes.
You mentioned the word deficits. Let me read another question that came in. Can the U.S. continue for long as the financial global hegemon with the persistent large fiscal deficits?
Well, what's a large fiscal deficit?
A large fiscal deficit is what we have.
Yeah, we do. That's what we have. I think it's hard, particularly the uncertainty over, the decades ahead when Medicare and Social Security and so forth seem to widen the deficit. But the deficit that's more to the point to me is the balance of payments deficit. I think we're back, in a way, in the Triffin dilemma, which I guess was not mentioned this morning, that we were in a position in the Bretton Woods system that with the other countries basically wanting to run surpluses and build their reserve positions, the reserve position of the United States inevitably weakened to the point we no longer could support the convertibility. Now you don't have a convertibility anymore, but how long can we expect as a country or a world to support how many trillions of dollars that the rest of the world has? Well, so far, so good, and the rest of the world isn't in very good shape. So we look pretty good at the moment. But suppose that situation changes and we're running big deficits, and however many trillion it is now, it's another trillion or so. At some point, there is a vulnerability there, I think, for the system, not just for the United States. And we ought to be conscious of that and do something about it. It's not so easy to do something about it, because that comes back to the whole question of international monetary reform, which is a favorite subject.
So the Chinese have been major buyers of U.S. government debt. They've been able to do that because they have had a large current account surplus. That surplus has come down from 10% a few years ago to less than 2% now. Right. If they pursue the policies they say they're going to pursue, it could easily disappear in the next couple of years. How should we think about the implications of that for the U.S.?
Well, I think that's good news. From the standpoint of what I just mentioned, that China is not the only other country in the world. But China was an important accumulator of dollars, and if they stop accumulating, the kind of worry I just expressed are somewhat alleviated, but it's not gone because our deficit continues. Now, our deficit is smaller too, but hopefully it can remain smaller. I'd hate to see our deficit go back to where it was. I'd like to see it, we're talking about current account deficit. I'd like to see it disappear, but it's hard to make it disappear. And no question about that.
Well, on that semi-optimistic note, let me thank you again for taking the time and giving us your views about all of this.